Why don't we sidetrack for a moment here between examples and go back to the front page. Now, I don't think you're going to use the front page ever again, but we should probably fill it out just in case. So let's do that right now. The top of the page asks what makes a question complex, and there's a couple of points that you should fill in there. Number one, there are more than one object moving. I'm going to write there are two objects moving, or two objects in motion. That's new. There were never questions in grade 11 really where there were two objects in motion, unless they were assignment questions. The second point is what makes it complex is you can't complete a givens list for either one. You can't complete a givens list for either object. In other words, there really is no starting point. And the third point that makes questions complex is the motion of the two objects is somehow interrelated. The motion is interrelated. In other words, if you want to add in even some more details here, the motion of one object depends on the motion of the other object and the givens of the other object. And that's what makes it, if you want to add a fourth point perhaps, just a little note to yourself, that's what mandates that you're going to solve it using two equations, two unknowns. That's skill from math class. So at the bottom of the page here, I put a few, maybe some little study notes that you might use for the first couple of questions, but I don't think you're going to think about them for very long. Like, I wanted to stress, what do you do when you have to label distance and you have a head-on collision? So here's object A and object B. They're 40 meters apart. They're heading toward one another. They're going to collide at some point. When you have a head-on collision, it should make sense to you. Please don't memorize off this page that the distance that one of the objects moves, you're going to have to label it as X, or Y, or T, or A, or whatever you want. Please don't think that X is some variable that means distance. It's just an unknown. But you have to label one of them as X, and then the other one, and this is just common sense, don't memorize this, it's a 40-meter gap. That would have to be 40 minus X. What if they're chasing each other? Because you do get questions where it's not a head-on collision, but one object is further ahead. Let's say I used 40 again. So object B is 40 meters ahead at the beginning of this, starts moving. A begins to chase after it, and at some point further on down the way, they collide and catch up to one another. Well, there's different ways that you could do this. Again, you have to label something as X. You could say that object B moves a distance X. And if that was the case, what would object A have to move in order to catch object B? Think about this. And again, don't memorize. Object A would have to move the exact same distance X, but 40 meters more, because it's got to close that 40-meter head start and then also move X. So object A would be 40 plus X. And there isn't one special way to do this or to label this. If I switch colors, and hopefully you can too, somebody might choose to label this as X for object A. Because again, you have to label your unknowns. If somebody decides to say, well, my object A is going to move a total distance X, catching up, then in that case, object B's movement would be what? Think about this. Not 40 minus X. Be very careful. If object A moved a total distance of X, and object B doesn't have to move that 40-meter head start, then object B's distance would be X minus 40. You see why I say you can't memorize off this page? if you have to flip back to this page every time to try and figure out how to do it, you're missing the point. You just got to think. You have to think with a clear head about what the general format to these distances would be in the questions. Time is a little bit trickier, and I'll tell you right now, the reason time is trickier is because of this word right here. Whenever we see the word wait, we are biased because of the English language to think that wait means we've got to add on more time. So think about this. Let's say you have object A and object B, and object A starts moving. I didn't put any arrows on here, just object A starts moving, and let's say that the time is given for object A for how long it moves for. Let's say we're given time t, whatever time that is. Actually, on most of the questions, I'm going to try and get you to use an unknown variable y for time, just because this is COVID and it's online learning, and I kind of want all the questions to sort of be the same, especially when you take them up. So I'm going to use a variable y for time on all the questions, and so I think maybe you should too. If you're given a question where object A moves and you're told how much time it moves for, time y, and object B waits 3 seconds and then it starts to move, what would object B's time be in relation to object A? It's very tricky because of the word wait. You immediately want to say, well, it would have to be y plus 3 because it waits 3 seconds. It's going to be 3 seconds more. That is actually incorrect. And the key to this is to remember that formulas and variables only describe time in motion. They don't describe time where an object is just sitting there waiting. It's only time in motion. So if object A moves for time y, and then you need to start a formula for object B. If it waits 3 seconds, it's in motion 3 seconds less than object A. Object A starts to move, B waits 3 seconds, and then it starts to move. It's actually 3 seconds less than object A. Think about that. It's a really confusing point at first, but it makes sense if you just think with a level head. In that very same situation, it might be the other way around. The object that starts to move immediately, how much time it moves for might not be given. Let's say that the object that waits for 3 seconds first and then it moves, let's say the time was given for that object. It told you how long it was. What would you do for the other object that started to move immediately? So again, same thought process. If y moves and it waited 3 seconds first, and A started to move immediately, that means that A is in motion 3 seconds longer than B, because B waits for 3 seconds. So if you were labeling the unknown time for B as unknown variable y, you would have to call A's time, because it moved 3 seconds first, y plus 3. If this is very confusing, maybe you shouldn't even use this sheet. Maybe you should treat question by question by question a brand new thought process for yourself when you're labeling variables. So let's do the second example, the football question. And this question is going to be much easier. So you're going to see that not all questions require complex math. Sometimes the solution works out very easily, and you don't know when that's going to happen. You certainly can't tell from reading a question that the solution is going to be mathematically easier or more difficult. So you just sort of have to plunge headlong into it. So I'm going to stop this video and start another one so that things are cut into smaller parts.